Hello everyone. 11 o'clock, I will start the webinar by Tēnā koutou katoa and welcome you to the first Link Online webinar under our new brand name, Bioeconomy Science Institute, New Zealand. I am Mona Mohtari, Principal Advisor Government and Commercial Team at Landcare Research Group, and welcome you all into this session today. Today's webinar is based on our new policy brief, Design and Delivery of Voluntary Biodiversity Credit Markets, 8 Difficult Problems. The purpose of this brief is to consolidate the key challenges in design considerations for voluntary biodiversity credit markets based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our presenters today are Dr. Susie Greenhalgh from Manaaki Whenua Group, Dr. Susan Walker from Manaaki Whenua, and Dr. Marie Doole from Mātaki Environmental. Just before handing over to Susie, I would like to give a bit of housekeeping rules. This webinar is recorded and will be made available online in upcoming days. And the Q&A function is already enabled live on the top left. Please ask your questions here, and we will aim to answer them at the end of the presentation. And any unanswered ones will be answered later and will be emailed to you after. So I will hand it over to Susie. Here you go, Susie.
Thank you, Mona. Tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. We hope that by the end of the seminar, you'll be aware of some of the challenges that we see facing biodiversity credit markets and why we must take a lot of care as we develop these markets. Next slide. We'll get there.
Should be there, Susie.
Thanks, Suze. One of the things, before we get started, I think it's really important that we actually understand what we mean by biodiversity credit. And we've used the Biodiversity Credit Alliance's definition, where a credit is a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is both durable and additional to what would have occurred otherwise. And I'd like you to keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the seminar, but just as importantly, as we think about what we need to do to continue to develop biodiversity credit markets in New Zealand. So biodiversity credit markets, they're not new, but in recent years, they've received quite a lot of attention. And so if you think about New Zealand in 2023, the New Zealand government started a consultation looking at the possible parameters for a biodiversity credit system here in New Zealand. And then a couple of weeks ago, they announced some steps to support the growth and also indicate their confidence in a voluntary nature credits market here in New Zealand. Next slide. So I guess the question is, why all this attention on biodiversity credit markets? Next slide, Suze. Why is all this attention on biodiversity credit markets? And we think there's 3 reasons for this. Firstly, there's an increasing gap between the public biodiversity goals and the public funding commitments that governments have chosen to make. And we see a really troubling trend globally where governments are actually withdrawing public funding for Indigenous biodiversity and then outsourcing that to the private sector. We're also seeing an increasing recognition of the need to support conservation beyond public land and onto private land as well. And there's also a desire for some companies to address nature impacts so they can either access finance, reduce risk, or just green their image. Next slide. So biodiversity credit markets are being promoted as a really promising way to achieve all of this. And at face value, they offer lots of opportunities. However, international and local experiences in carbon and biodiversity markets suggest there is a lot of reason to actually operate with some caution. So biodiversity credit markets are quite a difficult and expensive way to direct more investment towards conservation. And importantly, if they're done poorly, they can potentially accelerate harm to biodiversity. To date in New Zealand, the enthusiastic voices for the support of biodiversity markets have received far more airtime than the cautionary voices in New Zealand. So for some folks today, the points that we will talk about could be uncomfortable. However, our intention is to provoke careful thought in these very formative stages of market development so that we have a better chance of developing robust and enduring markets. So in this seminar, but also in the accompanying policy brief, you'll notice that we've actually focused on the wider system effects. That's how voluntary market may impact biodiversity protection and the policy system. We haven't focused on individual projects or schemes because there's a lot of contextual nuances to consider with those in those contexts as well. We also want to remind people that we're talking about voluntary biodiversity markets in this seminar. We are not talking about regulatory biodiversity offsets, which face many of the same problems, but also have additional problems to contend with. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Susan and Marie, who are going to run through some of the problems that we've identified.
Thank you very much, Susie. The first problem we discuss in the brief is that markets predicated on damage and loss are risky for biodiversity. And the way we explain this is to point out that there are really three possible sources of funding for biodiversity credits. So voluntary biodiversity markets are supposed to be concerned only with the first two, philanthropy and reputation. But in fact, the boundaries between all three of these are quite blurred and potentially murky, and they could become more murky over time. So the top one, purely philanthropic funding, can look completely nature positive at first glance, but there can be cost shifting. The perception that others are fronting up cash can give a government leeway to further reduce existing levels of public funding. And so you're further back than where you started, and there can be leakage. So credits might pay to fence off this wetlands, say, but a rational landowner may simply increase stocking rates outside the fence to maintain profit. So harm can be maintained, it's just shifted. So reputational credits can also look superficially quite benign, but the business case can be greenwash. That is, it can be continuation of environmentally unsustainable business or encouraging customers to buy more environmentally harmful services or products. And reputational credits also risk undermining new policy to reduce biodiversity loss because evidence that companies are doing good for biodiversity can add to a sort of soft political power to delay or reduce much needed regulation. So a claim that biodiversity credits are purely nature positive would be quite shaky under those scenarios. The third funding source, of course, is compliance. So a resource user must buy credits to gain resource consent to harm biodiversity elsewhere. And in these non-voluntary biodiversity compensation or offsetting markets, the risk of harm is really high because you need really clear regulatory restrictions, such as requirements for like exchanges, high standards for monitoring and compliance, and really strong institutions if you're going to avoid biodiversity loss. And biodiversity loss is pretty certain if generic biodiversity credits are able to be used to compensate for specific harm elsewhere. For example, a coal or a gold mine might be granted consent to remove an ecosystem if they buy credits from a seller who's planting native trees or doing pest control somewhere else. So other types of non-voluntary compliance markets could emerge in the future, such as if businesses are required to buy credits to offset harm in supply chains. The second of the 8 difficult problems is demand. So voluntary markets for carbon have so far failed to achieve the scale that's really needed to deliver substantial benefits for the climate, and there are a lot of similar concerns for voluntary biodiversity markets. So those markets are inherently sluggish. So one risk is that government invests in setting up and supporting markets, which then fail to launch or deliver fewer biodiversity gains that would be had through directly investing that money. So that's an efficiency problem. A second risk is that a seller more desperate for buyers is more likely to be open to funding from sources that risk harm to nature. That is, they're more likely to accept money from greenwash or compliance. And then low demand exacerbates the third problem, which is integrity. So integrity principles are the standards that carbon and nature markets use to limit the potential harms that are concealed in exchanges and to maintain the confidence of investors and communities. And weakening integrity is a real temptation for participants who need fluid markets with lots of transactions. But lowering an integrity bar is self-defeating if it reduces confidence in the quality of the credit. So in 2023, public exposure of low integrity in the voluntary carbon market led to its crash and the loss of more than half its value. And since then, there's been increased scrutiny, which has really raised the bar for integrity in all environmental markets. Now, it's many times more difficult to meet integrity principles in a biodiversity market than in a carbon market. And in our brief, we expand on 3 of the most thorny Additionality, showing that the improvement made to biodiversity would not otherwise have occurred, can be really very challenging, or in fact impossible to determine. And validating the claims of suppliers is therefore fraught, and incentives exist for gaming. And additionality really narrows the participation in a market, because biodiversity outcomes of pre-existing activities and obligations simply don't meet additionality requirements. They don't get in the door, and that narrowing is often strongly resisted. Then there's leakage, which, as I've said, is the displacement of human activities that harm biodiversity away from the site of an intervention to other places. And this can be extremely difficult both to detect and to do anything about. And some experienced commentators reckon this is the most difficult thing to manage of all. And then to satisfy permanence and durability principles, immediate gains have got to endure, and risks and barriers to durability range very widely, from land tenure problems, breaches of compliance requirements, failed restoration methods, extreme weather events. And then there's the problem, as we know, that gains from many conservation activities in New Zealand are likely to be quickly reversed. And sorting all of this is a lot more challenging than simply mapping a project boundary and creating a legal protection mechanism. And our policy brief noted, but we didn't try to tackle, the other foundational integrity principle, which is that voluntary biodiversity markets must meet standards for equity and fairness to people, including Indigenous communities. The fourth problem is the likelihood of unintended outcomes, which go beyond cost shifting and leakage. So in a poorly designed voluntary market, the prospect of payments can greatly dampen existing or potential voluntary effort, or worse, that can incentivize neglect or deliberate degradation over voluntary stewardship. It can push the starting line back. Voluntary biodiversity markets are also vulnerable to adverse selection. That's the thing, that self-chosen project areas are usually those with the lowest opportunity cost to the rational landowner, which are generally those under least threat. So you may not be getting a lot extra. Markets can also incentivize the cheapest, lowest value restoration, or a focus on the most charismatic creatures that sell best. So those easy wins can actually delay or crowd out other actions that may be more valuable. And they can create norms and build in resistance to higher standards that might expose previous efforts as inadequate. So those are some of the people problems, but nature can also throw curveballs at the best of intentions. So, for example, if you selectively remove some predators, say you trap possums or stoats, this can release others, such as rats and mice, which might even cause greater harm to smaller birds, lizards, invertebrates, or fruiting plants. If you remove grazing and browsing mammals to benefit native plants, you can potentially release weeds, which then take over and smother. And planting common woody species, which is easy, can actually remove critical habitat for more threatened species, which are low growing and light demanding. So those effects, those ecological effects, all depend on where you are, your spatial context. Many are not fully understood, and they can be really difficult to predict. So that's me. I'm going to hand over to Marie now. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everyone. I'm going to present the latter four problems that we think need to be navigated for a high integrity nature market. Problem 5 is that adequate biodiversity currencies are neither simple nor easily measurable. Biodiversity markets that work for nature rely on an accurate description of biodiversity interventions and the difference that they make to attract and maintain investment. Biodiversity is much more complex to measure than carbon, so defining the units for trade is necessarily complex. Simplified metrics are likely to miss important information and may in fact obscure decline and loss. Next slide, please. Problem 6 is that durable voluntary biodiversity markets will be costly. Long-term successful markets will take energy, expertise, and underlying investment. The costs fall into two main buckets: the setup and overheads ongoing, and the individual costs of transaction, appreciating there's some overlap. The overhead and transaction costs together add a layer of expense that should be considered by all sides against other funding models and options. Again, efforts to simplify and streamline these costs usually have integrity trade-offs. Next slide, please. Problem 7 points to a really important issue in New Zealand and environmental management more generally, the data deficit. Much of our biodiversity is poorly understood, and much of our spatial data is patchy, is low resolution, and is quite old. And that is important in terms of the limitations that might be overlooked when they are used in a market setting to inform decisions. Biodiversity markets require both site-specific information and then to be able to contextualise that information in a broader framework. Using low-resolution data at fine scales will almost certainly obscure biodiversity loss. It is imperative that data quality, in addition to other issues such as data sovereignty, are addressed up front. Next slide, please. The fifth problem is the one that is very frequently ignored in nature markets, but is almost certainly material to failures in the future. New Zealand is a very small market. We have a small handful of individuals who are skilled in this area, although no doubt that will grow. Small markets have particular characteristics. It means that market players can become quickly oversubscribed, and much less experienced players can gain strong footholds and often prosper with nascent oversight. A wider risk is that small markets commonly create settings for significant conflicts of interest and for gaining soft power through private interests influencing, having undue influence over the decisions made in market design. And in addition, that comes with failures to detect fraudulent claims and the potential misappropriation of voluntary mechanisms for regulatory ends. The pilots recently announced by Manatu Mō the Ministry for the Environment, provide a really good range of useful examples to test some of our thoughts and theories about how this might work, and it will be important for those to be systematically evaluated and for those lessons to be carried forward. We'd see a critical role for government, taking a proactive stewardship role of the big picture, for third-party independent oversight, and for work to counter fraud and greenwashing. These usually affect the good players by undermining them, and so it's really important that those bad actors are weeded out. Market players themselves will support a high-integrity market by embracing radical transparency and by inviting and expecting scrutiny. It's resilience to scrutiny over time that builds confidence. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we welcome the exploration of nature markets in principle, so long as the high integrity aims are maintained. What we've talked about today are some of the very common pitfalls globally and locally with them to date. And if we understand these lessons, we can apply them, and then we can avoid some of the failures that other jurisdictions have not been able to avoid. We also need to carefully consider the role of nature markets in context. They have commonly been a shield for the withdrawal of public conservation funding, but we do need to work together. Our Indigenous biodiversity is stunning, but it's in dire straits. This needs to be an in addition to concept, not an instead of. For those asking for the brief, you can download it from the QR code on your screen now. And our next policy brief will explore some of the essential guardrails in voluntary nature markets, focusing, as Susie and Susan both said, on system-level risks primarily. Our contact details are on the subsequent slide, and for now I will pass it back to Mona. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. And I just would like to pass into our Q&A function and start browsing the questions. Cool, we've got a couple there and also some of them in the chat. If you can leave them in the Q&A function, that would be awesome. Cool, I start with the first one from Richard, which is, can you clarify your additionality comment about using existing projects, since I imagine many of those see BCs as a way of getting fundings? Any of the speakers, welcome to get in.
I'll start if you like.
Right, you go, Susie.
Sorry, we're all sort of waiting to see who it is. Yes, I think we have a real challenge with making sure that we have additional projects in New Zealand. A lot of the projects, a lot of work that's already been done on the ground, people are trying to find additional funding for, and so a lot of those wouldn't meet an additionality criteria. I think the challenge that we've got in New Zealand is like, yes, you've got a biodiversity market, but what are the other kinds of mechanisms that would you sit alongside a biodiversity credit market that would allow funding to also go to some of those existing projects that might be struggling to get funding because there's been a cutback or a reduction in sort of government or other funding that's been around. So I think it is a real challenge, Richard, but it's something that we must think about and we must contend, because the last thing we want is a market that doesn't stack up credibly in the global market, especially for companies. Marie, Susan, you might have something else to add.
No, I think you covered it pretty well, Suze.
Cool. Thank you, Susie. I would go to the next question from Ram Pandit, which has got a lot of likes there. Given the problems, what are the potential solutions, if any?
I can take that one. Thanks, Ram. I think some of the problems are intractable, that they are just risks that need to be managed as you move through the design and delivery of a market. For others, the solutions are sort of embedded in the discussion. You know, the deficits in data, then they need investment to improve the quality of data to support decision making. But our next policy brief is going to talk about some of the essential guardrails, and wherever possible, we will highlight where they link to the problems that we've identified. So hopefully the next brief will be instructive on some of that as well.
Oh, thank you, Marie. I go to the next one from James Griffin. What do you read into the changed central government messaging that's moved from biodiversity credit system to nature credits?
It's probably best to be answered by somebody from central government, to be perfectly honest, but my take would be that I wouldn't read that much into it. Interestingly, the term nature markets for biodiversity is something that's been happening globally. Australia now has a nature repair market, that's what they call it, rather than which was their biodiversity market. And the UK, the King of England's or King Charles's initiative is called a nature market as well, but it's very much focused on biodiversity. That would be sort of my take on it.
Right, thank you, Susie. We've got the other one with several likes from Alejandro, which is, have you made an assessment on how much of the S&A work that districts have done under the RMA would be robust enough to support this market mechanism? If so, how much is useful? If not, there's an intention to investigate this.
Susan, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, the answer is no. No, we haven't made an assessment of that.
Right.
I mean, I think a general comment that might be helpful there is that you know, the bar is quite high for entering this market as a participant, and so I think, you know, we just want to counter the expectation that this is going to be really easy and for everyone. I think it's going to be fairly bespoke and quite a lot, as Marie said, of expense, you know, up front. Yeah, getting it right is going to be costly, and there may be other mechanisms that should be considered for management of things like SNAs on private land, which might be both robust and cheaper and more cost effective, for example. So going straight to a market may not be the most efficient and effective way to improve SNAs on private land, for example.
Makes sense. Thank you, Susan. The next one I've got is, if you have a right to remove biodiversity, for example, through vegetation clearance, but then you don't, would that be considered a biodiversity credit?
I would say it depends. And the reason why I would say it depends is because if you might have a right to remove biodiversity, but you don't, there's probably a reason why you haven't done that already, and that you actually really like it, and the chances are going forward you wouldn't. I mean, almost everywhere in New Zealand has a right to remove biodiversity, but there's still an awful lot left there. And so the challenge that you have got, though, is that you might have perverse incentives here as well, where somebody goes, oh, if I quickly remove it, then I can restore it and get a biodiversity credit. But my question to those kinds of people that might be thinking along those sorts of lines is it's not cheap to enter into these markets. There's verification, there's a lot of transaction costs. So destroying biodiversity to enter into a market just because you can might sort of backfire on you in terms of cost and whether there's actually an adequate number of sellers to purchase that kind of that kind of action. Marie or Susan, have you got anything else to add there?
I think just to add to that from my perspective is that when we talk about what can go in the market and what is effectively excluded, it doesn't automatically follow that there no benefit is accrued to those excluded. In a policy situation, if you consider the system as a whole, if actors aren't able to enter the market because it would create unintended or perverse consequences or it would undermine integrity principles, then from a policy perspective, what you would generally look at is complementary measures. Complementary measures allow benefits to accrue to those excluded from a mechanism so that it doesn't have perverse consequences. And I think that's the sort of system level considerations that need to be made, because you can quite imagine the potential deleterious knock-on effects from people that are left out even though they've done good things like protected nature on their land and are doing active management. So this is the importance of a system level kind of perspective when we're looking at the effects of these mechanisms.
Thank you, Marie. So I'll get the next one. Can you clarify your additionality? I think I already gone through that one. Right, it's still got lots of likes. Cool, I'll go to the next one. Have you looked at valuing the ecosystem services associated with the vegetation and management? So trying in the value of biodiversity, carbon, water yield, and potentially pest management if applicable. Anyone?
Which is Susie.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because I think for many years now people have been asking for a bundled market of some description, primarily because it makes it much easier for somebody to sort of weigh and balance up all of them. So yes, we have, not for this policy brief, because this policy brief deals specifically with just biodiversity. But yes, we have done work around what a bundled system could look like, mainly around carbon and water, not biodiversity, because biodiversity has always been that thorny one, in particular around what metrics would you actually use and how would you apply that. The other interesting thing that comes up with individual markets is the additionality question. So if you do something for a carbon market, is it still additional for a biodiversity market? A lot of people say, yes, it is, but when you've got two separate markets set up, there is actually sort of conflict between those two markets, and we have to think about that quite differently. The other thing that also comes up is how do you actually price into two individual markets? So I think in reality what we'd like to see is more of a bundled market if we want to make this happen, and we have not seen much discussion around that in New Zealand. The only place where I know that they've played with a little bit is actually Australia about 10 or 15 years ago, where they actually set up an ecosystem service market that looked at about 5 different attributes, I think.
That is great, thank you. I think we can just get the last question here, which is, do you know how compatible these credits are with certifications or tools such as the coal farm, taking in consideration that some international markets are getting more strict in terms of sustainability?
I'll let the girls answer this, but I'm assuming you're talking about the Cool Farm tool, which I know a little bit about, not necessarily a lot. But one of the things around the Cool Farm tool, it's actually based on a lot of expert opinion. There's not necessarily, and it's a sort of a checklist that the farmer fills in. That would not be sufficient for a biodiversity credit market. It needs much more robustness around sort of what is on the farm, what is the action, what's being measured, and what the change is. So I don't think it'd pick up the level of detail that you'd be needing to actually actively enter a biodiversity market.
Well, thank you, Susie. I would probably have to just close it now, 11:30. I would like to thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you all our speakers for the great presentation on the biodiversity credit markets. Any unanswered questions will be answered and shared with you through the emails and the recording of that presentation as well. So recording also will be loading on the YouTube. So please do keep an eye on our website also for the upcoming webinars. And then we'll see you in the next session with us. You have a great day. Thank you.